On these Sunday nights, we're trying to finish in the study of the period of the kings, and we're really in 2 Kings. We'll spend a lot of time in chapter 17 tonight, so if you want to open your pew Bibles there, we'll finally get over to these verses in 2 Kings chapter 17. But there are some things that we need to look at that we did not finish up last week. We were in 2 Kings chapter 10, and we'll be making some reference to this. If I say the name Jehu, what do you think of? If I were a teenager, I would think one thing about Jehu. He drives furiously. And I would do that in case Mom or Dad said, "You are not Jehu, drive the speed limit." Joe, you at least know what they're talking about. He is that individual who, whenever he was ready to destroy Jezebel, the statement was made, "We don't know who he is, but he's sure driving like Jehu because he drives furiously." What a great man Jehu was. And whenever we say, you know how many kings there were in that northern kingdom? You remember that number? You remember how many of them were good? The closest you get to good is Jehu. And that's why we want to look at the latter part of his life tonight, because he did so many things right. I want us to spend a few minutes just jumping right in chapter 10 and verse 18. And we mentioned this last week, but we didn't have time to give all the details of it. Jehu is out to destroy Ahab and out to destroy Jezebel and out to bring an end to the house of Ahab. But there's one other thing that plagues the Israelites up in that northern kingdom, and that's the worship of Baal. You look in chapter 18 or chapter 10, verse 18. He gathers all the people together, and he says, you know Ahab really worshiped Baal, but I'm telling you, he only worshiped him a little. I'm going to worship him a lot. Now, just imagine you're a prophet of Baal. You just imagine what it would be like. You remember the battle that you lost not very long ago? You remember whenever Elijah faced down those 400 plus prophets of Baal up there and killed every one of them. And now all of a sudden they're without prophets, but now they have repopulated the land. And now there are all of these prophets of Baal, and it looks like Jehu is going to be the king. And I can imagine just how excited they were. The word comes out, we are really going to be Baalites from now on. We're going to really be those who worship Baal. And so he proclaims this feast. Now, read this chapter and become one of the prophets of Baal. He says, call to me all of the prophets of Baal and all of his servants and all of his priests. You get everybody that has anything to do with the worship of Baal, and don't miss a one. Let no one be missing, for we're going to have a great time. We're going to be sacrificing to Baal. And so all of these people assemble, and he sends messengers, verse 21, throughout all of Israel, and all of the worshipers of Baal came. There was not a man left who did not come. In that place is this great feast, and they assemble as the greatest time there's ever been for Baal on this earth. In fact, Jehu gives all of them garments to wear. And if you'll stop and think about how important garments are, you remember how the sin of Achan, he stole that garment from Babylon. I suspect these were not just ordinary garments. You know, we are really going to have the greatest time Baal. And so they all receive those garments, and they all come there. And he says, now wait a minute. Let's just make sure that in this place, verse 23, search and see that no servants of Jehovah are here. We want to make this a bailout convention. We want to have the gathering of every worshiper of Baal there is in the northern kingdom. And the interesting thing is, this may be the way, by the way, they sacrificed the servants of God from those who were not the servants of God. So they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. No child of God would do that, right? And so now here, this may be the very test. We want to know if everybody here is a worshiper of Baal. And so Jehu, they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Jehu has another plan, because he has 80 men who are evidently on the outside, and he says if anybody walks out of this building, if anybody escapes, whoever lets any person that's inside this building escape will be put to death. Your life for their life. And as soon as he made an offering to the end of the offering of the burnt offering, Jehu said to the guards and to the captains, go in and kill them, let no one come out. So they killed them with the edge of the sword. Then the guards and the officers threw them out and went into the inner house of the temple of Baal and brought out the sacred pillars out of the temple of Baal and burned them. they broke down the sacred pillar of Baal, tore down the temple of Baal, and made it a refuse dump until this day. Thus Jehu destroyed Baal from Israel. I think it's one of the great stories there. And we said last week that from this time on, you never read about the worship of Baal up in that northern kingdom. He did away with it. And so there are two individuals who destroyed the prophets of Baal. One is righteous Elijah, and the other is Jehu, who drives furiously. But then, having said all of that, look at verse 29. Jehu did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel to sin, that is, from the golden calves that were at Bethel and Dan. And anybody has a concept of you can still have some evil in your life, just make sure that you're gooder than you're badder. And I know that's not good English, but it's descriptive, isn't it? God's going to put our life in a balanced scale and put all the good on one side and all the bad on the other side. That's the attitude of most individual. He wasn't all that bad. Well, was he a child of God? No, but he wasn't all that bad. He's a child of the devil. What do you mean? If he's not a child of God, he's a child of the devil. And on Judgment Day, God's not going to put in the balance scale all the good that we've done. And if the good outweighs the bad, then we're going to go to heaven, regardless of whether we worship the Lord and we're servants of the Lord. Just not going to be that way. And Jehu is an illustration of it. And the Lord said to Jehu, verse 20, because you have done well in doing that which is right in my sight, and have done to the house of Ahab all that was in my heart, your son shall sit on your throne till the fourth generation. And here's a good way, by the way, to define what the word generation is, because we're going to read about his son and the next son and the next son, and the fourth son is the fourth generation. But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord. And so whenever we talk about all the great things that he did away with Jezebel, did away with the house of Ahab, he helped God fulfill some of the prophecies God had made. He destroyed all the prophets of Baal. Guess what? Still not right with God. Now we've got to hurriedly cover some of these things that are found, because we need to really. Let's turn over to chapter 13. In chapter 13, we then get to the study of Jehoahaz, who delivered Israel from the king of Syria. It's in verse 1. He reigned for 17 years, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. The anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. Chapter 13, verse 3. He delivered them into the hands of Hazael, into the hands of Benhadad. Jehoahaz pleaded with the Lord, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw the oppression of Israel because the king of Syria oppressed them. The Lord gave Israel a deliverer so that they escaped from under the hand of Syria. If that doesn't help you understand the nature of God, how long have these people been unfaithful to God? How many kings? 19 kings. We've studied probably, 13 or 14, maybe even 15 of them. Here we are studying all of these, and they've never worshiped God, and yet whenever the very nature of God is try to forgive people. The nature of God is not to get people and throw as many of them into hell as you can. That's the attitude some individuals had. And so here they are, they've been unfaithful to God, and when Jehoahaz pleads with the Lord raises up a deliverer. Then look at the next verse. Nevertheless, they did not depart from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, who made Israel to sin. They walked in them, even though the Lord had been so good to them. I think it's interesting, he left of the army of Jehoahaz 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers. That's all he's left. Now then, his son begins to reign, whose name is, in verse 10, Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, became king. He reigned 16 years, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. How many times you read that? He reigned, and he did evil. He reigned, and he did evil. He reigned, and he did evil. How many kings in that northern kingdom? 19 kings. How many of them did evil? Every one of them. There's not a righteous king among any of them. There's an interesting story, by the way, starting in verse 14 of that chapter, where Elisha becomes sick with the illness of which he was going to die. And Joash, and that's just another way of referring to Jehoash, because both words are used to refer to this king, Jehoash or Joash. And Elisha, he said, he comes to, the king comes to Elisha and wept over his face and said, "Oh, my father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen." What a reference is this, not back to the time when Elijah ascended into heaven in the chariots of the Lord. And Elisha said, "Take a bow and an arrow," some arrows. So he took himself a bow and some arrows, and he said to the king, Jehoash, "Put your hand on the bow." So he put his hand on it, and Elisha put his hand on the king's hand, and he said, "Open the east window and shoot." And so he opens the window, he shoots the arrow, and Elisha said, "The arrow of the Lord's deliverance and the arrow of deliverance from Syria, you must strike the king of Syria till you have destroyed them." So there's the other arrows. And he says, "Now take the rest of those arrows and hit the ground with it." And he hit the ground 3 times. And Elisha is so upset. The man of God was so angry. Why? Because when the Lord asks you to do something, you better, how would they say up in Alabama, do the whole hog or something like that. I mean, you've got to just throw all of it in there. And he took it, and I can just see him as he smites the ground. Elisha said, "Smite the ground," and he hits it 3 times. And Elisha said, "If you'd done that 7 times, you would have destroyed Syria. Now you're going to have 3 battles and be victorious in 3 of them. But if you'd just done fervently what the Lord told you to do," isn't that verse in Jeremiah that says, "Cursed is that man who does the work of the Lord negligently." I'm telling you, you better not play it being just play church. You better not just play it being a Christian. You'd better be that kind of individual. When the Lord says this is what you must do, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all of your might. That's the only way we can live in serving God. And Elisha was angry with him, and he said, "You should have struck it 5 or 6 times. You would have struck Syria till you had destroyed it, but now you will strike Syria only 3 times. And Elisha dies. Can I show you one of the most amazing stories about Elisha? Just in 2 verses. They buried him, and the raiding band from Moab invaded the land of the spring of the year. So it was that after Elisha was dead and was buried, that this raiding band came in. They were taking another man to bury another man, and they looked up and they see this raiding group that's come evidently from Moab. And so what do? Well, they put the man in the tomb of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. Isn't that an amazing story? I'm so fascinated by things like this. You know, it's the rest of the story that you'd like to know. Let me ask you, where would you want to be buried? Where would you not want your mother-in-law to be buried? I mean, you stop and think about it. Here is the, I wonder how many lepers went to the River Jordan and dipped 7 times in the River Jordan. And I wonder if anybody ever went back and said, "Well, I think I want to be buried right next to Elisha. In fact, right on top of him would be real good." You know, interesting story. But all this is, and keep this in your mind, you remember how many miracles Elijah did? 7. You know how many miracles Elisha did? 14. He asked for a double portion of the spirit of Elijah. He did twice the miracles. And the reason for all of this was to authenticate the office of prophets. So when Jeremiah comes along, when Isaiah comes along, or Hosea comes along, or Joel or Amos, when they come along, they don't have to perform miracles. Why? God has already authenticated the office of those who are prophets. And so we just have on the screen that King Jehoash recaptures cities from Syria. We'll not spend any time looking at that. Let's look quickly at the last kings of Israel. You look at the location of the verses on the screen. There's Jeroboam, and by the way, this is Jeroboam the second. This is not Jeroboam the son of Nebat who made the golden calf. This is Jeroboam the son of Joash, or Jehoash. He reigns 41 years, and there it is. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. His son Zechariah, reigned 6 months, and he did evil. Shallum, he's not a descendant by the way of Jehu, because Zechariah is the 4th generation, and after him there will be no more sons of Jehu who will reign. And Shallum reigns for a month, and after him is Menahem. He reigns 10 years, and he does that which is evil. Pekaniah reigns 2 years, and he did that which was evil. Pekah reigned 20 years, and he did that which was evil. And Hoshea reigned 9 years, and he did that which was evil. You know, you ever have it up to here with your kids? I've had it up to here. God finally got to that point. How evil do you have to be? Did that which was evil in the sight of God, and God finally had it up to here, and God said, that's it. And that's why, if we turn to chapter 17, we come into 2 Kings chapter 17 to a chapter that you need to know where it is in the Bible. It's a pivotal chapter of the Old Testament. There are chapters that are important. You need to know where the Ten Commandments are. It would be such a blessing for there to be chapters that you know where they are in the Bible, but this is one chapter you really, really need to know where it is. Because you see, it is the chapter that tells of Israel's rejection of God and the judgment of God that is brought upon them. These verses, several of them have already been read, but look starting in chapter 17, verse 7. It was so that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt. And they feared other gods, and had walked in the statutes of the nations whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel, and of the kings of Israel which they made. Also the children of Israel secretly did against the Lord their God things that were not right. And they built for themselves high places, mountain tops, where they could put their idols, high places in their cities, from watchtower to fortified city, different kinds of cities. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and wooden images on every high hill and under every green tree. There they burned incense on all the high places, like the nations whom the Lord had carried away before them, and they did wicked things to provoke the Lord God to anger. For they served idols, of which the Lord had said unto them, you shall not do this thing. Where did all this start? Where did they start worshiping idols? Evidently, there's not that much of a problem in the time of Abraham or the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being involved in it. How much do we know about the other descendants, about Ishmael or about Esau? How much do we know about idolatry? Oh, it's there, but it's not, But when did the Jews start doing it? Almost from the day they left Egypt and went out into the wilderness. They arrive at Mount Sinai, and the Lord speaks from the top of that mountain and says to them, you shall have no other gods. And the second commandment is, thou shalt not make any graven image. How long did it take them to disobey God? Moses goes up to the mountains. He's up in the mountains, receives the 10 Commandments for the first time, and finally God says, Moses, get down off of this mountain. And there's those golden calves, or the golden calf that Aaron made. Whenever they were to go into the promised land, the Lord said to the Jews, when you get into that promised land, you destroy every idol that's there. And we've said this before, but the impact of it is something we need to think about. When you get into that land, you not only destroy the idols, don't you even speak the name of a single idol in the presence in the presence of any Jew. Now you stop and think about it. Those Israelites who went into that promised land, if they had done what God said, the Israelites, their children, would never even be able to ask about these other gods. If you destroy the idols and destroy the names of the idols, the next generation cannot ask about it. Why? There's no vocabulary for it. You stop and think about it. Suppose a generation destroyed curse words, destroyed all the curse words, and another generation came along, and never in their life did they ever hear any of the four-letter words or any of the profanity that's a part of our culture. That generation comes along. There's no way for them to curse. They don't know the words. God's plan was perfect. But when they got to the land, they left some of the nations that were there, and they immediately, in the book of Judges, when they got to the promised land, they immediately began to serve the other gods. And from that time, from the time they leave the land of Egypt until the time whenever we get to this chapter that we're reading, they have worshiped idols in every single generation. Almost. I guess perhaps the days of David they may not have, but there was still, the nations were there. And so there never was a time when they didn't worship idols. How many years is that? What's the date of the time they leave the land of Egypt? There are various dates that are given, but if it's, 1300, 1400, maybe even 1500, generally we say that the Mosaical age lasted for 1500 years. And so 1400 or 1500 years before Christ, they start worshiping idols. And here they are, worshiping the idols, and the Lord finally says, I have had it up to here. You look at verses 14 to 17. They would not hear, but they stiffened their necks like the necks of their fathers who did not believe in the Lord their God. They rejected His covenants, His statutes and His covenants which He had made. He had testified against them. They followed idols and became idolaters and went after the nations who were around. Verse 16, they left all of the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves a molded image of two calves and a wooden image, and worshiped all the host of the heavens and served this wooden image named Baal. And yet the Lord was pleading with them. Look in verse 13. Even while they are rejecting God for hundreds of years, the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all of the prophets, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes according to all the laws which I commanded your fathers and which I sent to you by my servants the prophets. Nevertheless, they would not hear. They stiffened the neck. And so as they had rejected God, verse 17 and 18, God rejected them. Sometimes we think about a loving God, but we need to understand that He's a just God. He's going to reward individuals for the way that they live. Look in verse 17, says, they caused their sons and daughters to pass through the fire. What's that? Well, that's when they offered their babies as sacrifices. There was a large fire inside a hollow image, one of those idols. It had sort of the hands of a maid, the hands of a man, though it looked like a calf or something, some animal. And they'd build a fire inside this image. And when that image, that metal image, when those hands would get really, really hot, they'd take their little babies and lay their babies up on the arms of that image, and they'd be screaming, and they would be beating the drums and praising that God while their children were burned to death. God said, I've had it up to here. And folks, if we don't think America is in danger of the judgment of God because of the abortions that are going on, we haven't learned the God of the Old Testament. Verse 18. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from His sight. And there was none left but the tribe of Judah. What year did this happen? What year did this happen? What is the date of the fall of that northern kingdom? That's one of the questions on those cards that we need to be learning, folks. I would beg of you to spend time learning the things on those cards and not just arbitrarily things that are there. If you want to know the Bible, take time and learn those things on this card. If they came out of Egypt in 1500 BC, how many years are they involved in worshiping idols? How long does it take God to reach the attitude that says, I've had it up to here? The date of the fall of that northern kingdom, an important biblical date, 722 BC. And God said, I've had it with you. And so He allows the king of Assyria to come. Verse 21 says, He tore Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. And the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam which he did, and they did not depart from them. From the time of the divided kingdom, they do not depart from the worship of those golden calves until the Lord removed Israel out of His sight. Verse 23, as He had said by all of His servants the prophets, Israel was carried away from their own land to Assyria, as it is this day. God's had it up to here with Israel. Well, what happened? Well, we still got the southern kingdom. We haven't dealt much at all with the southern kingdom. Our study has been of that northern kingdom. But you know what happened in the northern kingdom? Starting in verse 24, you know what the king of Assyria does? He brings people from Babylon and from Cuthah, Ava, Hamath, Sepharvaim, and placed them in the city of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and dwelt in the cities. You know what his practice was? When he conquered a land, he'd take the inhabitants of that land, many of them, and take them to a foreign land. And as at this time he was ruler over Babylon, he just took some of the Babylonians and brought them over there into the land of Israel, up in that northern kingdom. And all of a sudden there's an intermarriage that goes on. And the result of that is a group we read about in the New Testament called the Samaritans. Not Jewish, though they have Jewish background. Not Gentile, because they have a Jewish background. There they are up in that northern kingdom. Let's quickly look at what happened there. Look how many times, starting in verse 25. In the beginning of their dwelling, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them who killed some of them. By the way, when you read this, don't think mountain lions. We think our lions are restricted down to Africa in our day, and we just assume it's that way. It was not that way evidently back in biblical times. Lions were up in that area. So they spake to the king of Assyria and said, the nations whom you have removed, these Jews, the nations that you have brought in, do not know, and look at this, they do not understand the rituals of the God of this land. We don't know the rituals of how we're to worship God. We know the rituals of worshiping our God. You know what's wrong with ritualistic religion? Everything. It doesn't touch the heart. So we don't know the procedures that are here. And so what are we going to do? Because we're not doing the rituals that the God of the northern kingdom wants us to do. What are we going to do? So the king of Assyria, verse 27 says, find one of the priests and bring him back, that let him teach the rituals of the God of this land. That's verse 27. So one of the priests that had been carried from Samaria and came and dwelt in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. All right, now we've got it, right? However, every nation continued to make their own gods. Verse 30 mentions the men of Babylon and then some of the other individuals and some of the gods that they made. Verse 32 says, they feared the Lord, and from every class they appointed for themselves priests of the high places. Wait a minute. Priests could only come from the tribe of Levi. There are no Levites up in that part of the land, evidently. There are not many if there are. And yet here they are, we're going to fear God. Well, what about this priesthood? Well, we'll just take anybody and make him a priest. Verse 33 has an amazing statement. They feared the Lord and served other gods. The statement is, according to the rituals of the nations. They took the rituals of the nations around them and brought the rituals of the nations that were around them and tried to bring them into the service of God. Shall we never learn as a nation? And will the church never learn that just because the nations around us have religious rituals, that we ought to bring religious rituals that are not specified from God and say to the God of heaven, the nations around us have these rituals and therefore we're going to have these rituals in the Lord's church. You stop and think, in an application of that, the practice of sprinkling water on a baby. Where does that come from? Why would anyone want to bring the sprinkling of water on an infant into the service and the teachings of God whenever that's not in the Bible at all? And yet from one group to another, religious rituals are passed around. Sometimes visitors to our services, they'll come and want to see the building or something. I'll be showing them around the building. They say, where does your choir sit? Well, how many choirs did they have in the Bible? Well, don't you really think it'd be better if we brought a choir into here and put some of our best singers and make a choir out of the best singers? How does the practice of a few individuals singing fulfill the biblical teaching, speaking to one another in the plural? All of you speaking to the rest of you in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And the glorification of the melodious voice of individuals who perhaps sing better, at least understand the melody part of it better than others. How on earth did we decide that the melody that comes out of the throat is more acceptable to God than the melody that the Lord says every one of us has when we sing to God? Where does the choir sit? I'd say, I'll show you where the choir sits. They sit right here. That's right. Why don't we have it? Because it's a ritual that has been brought into the religion that was not specified by God. Folks, if this is going to be a church of Christ, then we've got to do what Christ says. And we cannot fear the Lord in words and bring in rituals. It makes no difference how often the nations around them do. And that's so important. We could talk so much more about that. Could I read this to you again? Verse 34, to this day they continued practicing the former rituals, they do not fear the Lord. Why? Because when you fear the Lord, you're going to do what the Lord said. Look in verse 39. But the Lord your God you shall fear, and He will deliver you. Verse 40. Howbeit they did not obey, but they followed their former rituals. So these nations feared the Lord, yet served their carved image, also that the children and their children's children have continued doing as their fathers did. Interesting concept. God's had it up to here. And He removes from His sight 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel and wipes them out. In fact, in one of the prophets He says, I will overthrow Israel. We need to be serious about our service of God. There are some other things from 2 Kings 17 that we could look at. But would you just mark that chapter, mark it in your Bible, put some note around it, I don't know, but so you can find this chapter? Because some of you you're going to need to know where this chapter is. Because it's the pivotal chapter in history. It is the time of the end of that northern kingdom. No more will it exist. God overthrows it. Now, just so you'll know where we're headed in this study on Sunday nights, we're going to, if things go according to the plan, very soon we'll start looking at the prophets that preached to that northern kingdom. We spent all of the time since January talking about that northern kingdom. And now we're going to take time and look at the prophets that preached to those individuals in that northern kingdom. I hope you will come, because now that you have the concept of the 800 years of idolatry. And when you get to the end of it in 2 Kings 17, he says, and He sent all of His prophets with them, begging them to turn. You now know the historical setting of the books that we shall begin to study soon. I love these Sunday night studies. There's so many things in it that we just haven't thought about in a long time, and maybe stories we have not heard. But let's get to that part of our service where we say to anyone, are you right with God? Are you ready to make a commitment of your life to the Lord? You can do it right now. If you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, just make up your mind. I'm going to yield. I'm going to follow Him. And because of that decision, I will unashamedly confess that I believe He's the Son of God, and I will submit myself, humble myself, and let someone immerse me in water, because I'm being immersed into the death of Jesus, and I'm being washed in the blood of Jesus. Those are Bible ways to describe what baptism is. If you haven't done that, you need to do that. Not someday. You need to do that tonight. You could come down these aisles when we sing in just a minute and be baptized tonight. Wash away every sin in the blood of Jesus. Now, if you've done that as a child of God, you've wandered away, I hope you know what you need to do. You need to come home. Come back to the Lord. Whatever is your need, won't you let it be known by coming to the front right now. As together we stand and sing. Will you